You are standing in a cave in what is now Somerset, England, roughly 10,000 years ago, and you are looking at a man who will, thousands of years later, be pulled out of the rock by scientists and given a name, Cheddar Man. He has blue eyes. He has dark, curly hair. And when researchers finally sequenced his DNA in 2018, they found something that broke almost everyone's assumptions in a single afternoon. His skin was dark. Not tan. Not olive. Dark, closer to the skin tone you'd associate today with parts of West Africa, sitting in the middle of what is now the English countryside, in a body that was, genetically, unmistakably European. And here's the thing that should stop you cold. We have been telling ourselves a story where skin color spreads across the map the way you'd expect, dark near the equator, gradually lightening as you move toward the poles. A smooth gradient that's been sitting there quietly for as long as humans have lived in each place. Cheddar Man says that's wrong. Ancient DNA from hunter-gatherers across Europe, from Spain to Hungary to Luxembourg, keeps turning up the same result. Dark skin, in Europe, thousands of years after humans supposedly should have gone pale, sitting there for millennia longer than almost anyone expected. So here's the question, the one this entire video is built around. If light skin wasn't just what happens naturally once humans moved far enough from the equator, and if it clearly took far longer to show up in some places than we assumed, then what actually caused it? Why did some human populations lose the dark skin that every single one of our ancestors originally had, while others kept it? And why did the whole process take so much longer, and happen so much more unevenly, than the simple story you probably learned in school? And the answer is not just less sun, less pigment, done. That's the version that fits on a textbook page and moves on. The real answer involves a molecule your body cannot survive without, a vitamin your skin manufactures out of literally nothing but sunlight, a genetic mutation that shows up completely independently in two different populations on two different continents using two different genes, and a full-blown scientific reversal. Ancient DNA quietly overturning decades of assumptions in the space of about 10 years. Because here's the thing nobody tells you, dark skin is not the deviation in this story. It's the default. It's the setting every single human being carry for the overwhelming majority of our species' existence, and losing it wasn't a single event. It happened more than once, in different places, for different reasons, and dramatically more recently than you'd expect. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is the part almost nobody thinks about. Roughly 7 million years ago, the ancestors of humans looked a lot more like modern chimpanzees than modern people, and that includes their skin. Underneath a full coat of body hair, their skin was almost certainly pale, the same way a chimpanzee's skin is pale pink under its fur today. Fur did the sun blocking. Skin didn't need to bother. But somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, something happened that changed everything downstream. Our ancestors started losing their fur. The leading explanation involves a shift toward long-distance walking and running on the open savanna, hunting and scavenging across huge, hot distances, which meant a serious cooling problem. Fur traps heat. A furry, sweating body overheats fast. So natural selection appears to have favored bodies that could dump heat efficiently through sweat glands spread across bare skin, and once the fur thinned out, the skin underneath was suddenly exposed to direct equatorial sunlight for the first time in the species' history. And that created an entirely new problem: ultraviolet radiation. UV light doesn't just tan skin. It breaks down a nutrient called folate, one that happens to be absolutely essential for cell division, for healthy sperm production, and critically, for preventing severe birth defects during pregnancy. A newly bald, newly exposed human wandering around the equator with pale skin would have been sitting under a constant, invisible assault on the exact molecule needed to reproduce successfully. So the same evolutionary pressure that made us lose our fur also, almost immediately, created intense pressure to protect the skin underneath it. And the solution the body reached for was melanin, the pigment that absorbs and scatters UV radiation before it can do that damage. Populations with more melanin protected their folate. Populations without it, in that unforgiving equatorial sun, quietly had fewer surviving, healthy offspring. Over enough generations, dark skin didn't just become common. It became close to universal, because in that specific environment, it was the only version of the trait that let reproduction go smoothly. This is why every single human ancestor, every one, going back well over 1 million years, is now believed by researchers to have had dark, heavily melanated skin. Not most. All of them. So if every human ancestor was dark-skinned, the real mystery isn't why some people have dark skin today. It's why anyone doesn't. Here's where the second problem enters the story, and it's the flip side of the folate danger. Human skin doesn't just block UV radiation with melanin. It also uses UV radiation, specifically to manufacture vitamin D, a nutrient your body cannot produce any other way in meaningful quantities and cannot easily get enough of from most traditional diets. Sunlight hits a compound in your skin and converts it, step by step, into the active form of vitamin D your bones, your immune system, and your muscles all depend on. And this is where melanin becomes a double-edged trait instead of a simple advantage. The same pigment that protects folate from UV damage also blocks a percentage of the UV radiation your skin needs to make vitamin D. Near the equator, where sunlight is intense and constant year-round, that's a fine trade. There's more than enough UV getting through even with heavy pigmentation to make all the vitamin D you need. But move far enough from the equator, into regions with weaker sunlight, shorter days, long gray winters, and that trade stops being fine. Dark skin in a low UV environment can mean chronically insufficient vitamin D, which historically meant a nutrient deficiency disease called rickets, weakened, deformed bones, along with broader problems for immune function and, again, reproduction. So as populations migrated out of Africa over the last roughly 70,000 years, spreading into the Middle East, into Europe, into Central Asia, they walked directly into a new evolutionary problem. The same skin that had protected their ancestors near the equator was now actively working against them. And this is exactly where the story gets stranger than the simple gradient map, because you'd expect skin to just lighten smoothly, and immediately as populations moved north. It didn't. Ancient DNA has shown that hunter-gatherers across huge parts of Europe were still dark-skinned as recently as 8 to 10,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years after their ancestors first arrived on the continent. Cheddar Man wasn't an anomaly. He was representative of an entire population that simply hadn't lightened yet, despite living somewhere that, by the textbook logic, should have selected hard for pale skin almost immediately. So what were they doing instead, for tens of thousands of years, to survive with dark skin under weak northern sun? The likely answer involves diet, and it's one of the more elegant explanations in the entire story. Hunter-gatherers eat a lot of meat, organ meat, and fish, and several of those foods, particularly fatty fish and animal liver, are naturally rich in vitamin D. If you're getting a steady supply of vitamin D directly from what you eat, you don't need your skin to manufacture nearly as much of it from sunlight, and the evolutionary pressure to lighten your skin drops dramatically. The problem only becomes severe once a population's diet changes, and that's precisely what happened when farming spread across Europe. Agricultural populations shifted heavily toward grains, and grains are a poor source of vitamin D. So the moment large groups of people started eating mostly bread and porridge instead of fish and organ meat, they lost their dietary backup plan for vitamin D at the exact same time they were living under weak, high-latitude sun. That combination, agriculture plus low UV, appears to be what finally applied strong, decisive selective pressure for lighter skin in Europe, and it lines up disturbingly well with the genetic evidence, which suggests some of the key European lightning mutations only became common a few thousand years after farming arrived, not tens of thousands of years earlier when people first walked into the continent. And here's the detail that turns this from a simple story into a genuinely strange one. East Asian populations also evolved lighter skin, independently, using largely different genetic mutations. The gene most associated with light skin in Europeans, called SLC24A5, is nearly absent in East Asian populations, who instead show strong selection on a different set of genes, including one called OCA2 and others still being mapped out by researchers. In other words, evolution didn't just lighten human skin once and spread that single solution around the world. It solved the exact same problem: not enough UV for vitamin D, twice, separately, using different genetic tools, in populations that had already split apart tens of thousands of years earlier. That's not a smooth gradient radiating outward from Africa. That's two, and possibly more, completely independent depigmentation events, converging on a similar visible outcome for similar underlying reasons, without ever sharing the specific mutation that got them there. It's worth being precise about the timeline here, because the numbers themselves are part of what makes this story surprising. Modern humans are generally thought to have begun leaving Africa in meaningful numbers somewhere between 50 and 70,000 years ago, though some earlier, smaller migrations may go back further still. That means, going purely off the Cheddar Man evidence, populations lived in Europe for tens of thousands of years, generation after generation, while remaining dark-skinned the entire time. If you'd been able to walk across Mesolithic Europe 8,000 years ago, long after agriculture had already begun in the Near East, you would have encountered communities of hunter-gatherers with dark skin and, in many documented cases, strikingly light-colored eyes, a combination that simply doesn't exist in significant numbers in Europe today. The population that would eventually become recognizable as typically European in appearance, pale skin paired with light eyes and hair, didn't fully assemble itself until waves of Near Eastern farmers and later Bronze Age migrations from the Eurasian steppe mixed with those original hunter-gatherer populations, blending genes, including pigmentation genes, from multiple, separately evolved sources into the mix you'd recognize today. Indigenous populations in the Americas add another wrinkle to this pattern, and it's a useful one for testing the whole theory. Many indigenous groups living at high latitudes in North America have noticeably darker skin than Europeans living at similar latitudes, and for a long time that looked like it might poke a hole in the whole sunlight and vitamin D explanation. But the timeline actually supports it perfectly once you look closely. Humans only reached the Americas somewhere in the range of 15 to 20,000 years ago, migrating across from populations in Siberia and Beringia who likely already carried some degree of lighter pigmentation adapted to their own high-latitude environment, and who relied heavily on fish and marine mammal fat, both rich in vitamin D, for food. Once those populations spread south into the Americas, many of them kept diets built around fish, seals, and other vitamin D-rich foods for thousands of years, which meant the intense selective pressure for lighter skin, the kind that hit European farmers switching to a grain-based diet, simply wasn't as strong or wasn't applied in the same way. Different starting point, different diet, different result. Exactly what you'd expect if diet and geography are doing the driving, rather than skin color being some fixed, ancient marker locked in place from the moment people arrived somewhere. Which means the phrase ancient humans went from black to white is actually hiding a much more interesting reality underneath it. There was never a single moment, a single switch, a single population that went pale and then spread that trait to everyone else. There were multiple separate populations, on separate continents, independently running the same basic cost-benefit calculation, folate protection against vitamin D production, and landing on different answers depending on their latitude, their sunlight, and critically, their diet. Some populations barely changed at all. Indigenous groups near the equator across Africa, parts of South Asia, Australia, and the Pacific retained dark, highly melanated skin for the same reason their ancestors evolved it in the first place. The UV protection still outweighs any vitamin D shortfall, because there's more than enough sun. Lightning only happened, and only made sense, in the specific populations that ended up living far from the equator, and it happened on wildly different timelines depending on what else was happening in their diet and their migration history. There's an additional layer to this that most people never hear about, and it involves a group of humans who aren't technically us at all. When modern humans migrating out of Africa encountered Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, they interbred, and modern non-African populations today still carry small but measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA as a result. Some researchers have found evidence that certain pigmentation-related gene variants in modern Europeans and Asians may trace back to that interbreeding, meaning the Neanderthals, who had already been adapting to low UV European environments for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived, may have effectively handed some of their own light skin adaptations directly to the newcomers, shortcutting a process that might otherwise have taken far longer to evolve from scratch. It's a strange thought. Part of what makes a modern European skin the color it is may not have evolved in modern humans at all, but was inherited from an entirely separate branch of the human family tree that no longer exists. And the vitamin D side of this story isn't just ancient history either. Rickets, the bone-deforming disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, surged dramatically during the Industrial Revolution in cities like London and Manchester, so severely that it became known across parts of Europe as the English disease. Coal smoke blackened the skies over industrial cities, blocking a huge percentage of the UV light that would otherwise reach the population, while people worked long hours indoors in factories, cut off from what sunlight there was. Even with all the genetic adaptations built up over thousands of years, a population can still be pushed back into deficiency if its environment changes fast enough, which is a small, sobering reminder that this entire evolutionary story is really just a very slow, very old version of a problem that's still capable of resurfacing under the right, or wrong, conditions. There's one more twist worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire question one final time. If lighter skin only became strongly favored a few thousand years ago, in specific populations, for specific dietary and geographic reasons, then skin color is one of the most recently evolved, fastest changing visible traits in the entire human species, not some ancient, fixed marker that's been stable for hundreds of thousands of years. It's closer to a live, ongoing adjustment than a finished product. Different populations are, in a sense, still mid-process, having started that adjustment at different times, from different starting diets, under different skies. The map of human skin color you see today isn't a snapshot of something ancient and settled. It's a freeze frame of several separate, still relatively recent experiments in trading UV protection for vitamin D production, running at different speeds, in different places, for reasons that have nothing to do with hierarchy and everything to do with latitude, and what happened to be on the dinner table. So the next time you look at a map of human skin tones stretched across the globe and assume you're looking at something old and finished, remember Cheddar Man, sitting in that cave with dark skin and blue eyes, 10,000 years after his ancestors supposedly should have gone pale. The real timeline is messier, more recent, and more independently reinvented than almost anyone realizes, and there's a piece of it we haven't touched yet. The genes involved in skin color didn't just control pigment. Some of them appear to be tangled up with other traits entirely: hair color, eye color, even aspects of skin cancer risk today, and untangling which changes came bundled together by accident, and which ones were separately selected for their own reasons, is a story that's still being written by researchers right now, with new ancient genomes rewriting parts of it every single year.